The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Nurse Rita Patel shuffled through another stack of patient charts at the nurse's station. It was 3 a.m., and the quiet hum of the geriatric ward at Metropolitan General Hospital did little to ease her growing exhaustion. This was her third 12-hour shift in a row, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story of someone pushed to their limits. "Hey, can you cover Mrs. Anderson in room 204? I need to help with a fall risk in 210, her colleague whispered, already rushing down the hallway before Rita could properly respond. She just nodded, adding another task to her mental checklist that seemed to grow longer with each passing hour. Rita's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her lukewarm coffee, her fourth cup of the night. As she took a sip, her phone buzzed with another text from the bank. Reminder: your student loan payment is due in 3 days. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the anxiety that had been her constant companion lately. Between the $80,000 in student loans and the rent increase notice she'd received last week, her finances were stretched impossibly thin. The memories of last month's breakup didn't help either. After 3 years together, her boyfriend had decided he needed space, through a text message, no less. "I can't handle your crazy work schedule anymore," he'd written, as if her dedication to saving lives was some sort of character flaw. "Nurse, nurse." The familiar call from room 212 interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Kumar needed his pillows adjusted again for the 5th time tonight. Rita forced herself to take a deep breath, but her patience was wearing dangerously thin. The understaffing at the hospital had reached critical levels, with 3 nurses calling in sick just this week. The remaining staff were expected to pick up the slack as usual. Walking down the dimly lit corridor, Rita caught her reflection in a window. She barely recognized the person staring back at her, hair messily pulled back, scrubs wrinkled from countless hours of rushing between patients, and eyes that looked more defeated than she cared to admit. She remembered her graduation day just 2 years ago, full of hopes and dreams about making a difference in people's lives. Reality, it seemed, had other plans. The night shift dragged on relentlessly. Rita dealt with a confused patient who tried to leave the ward, changed countless bed sheets, administered medications to 20 different patients, and somehow managed to scarf down half a granola bar during what was supposed to be her lunch break. Her feet ached in her worn-out nursing shoes. She'd been meaning to buy new ones for months but couldn't justify the expense. "Rita, can you handle the new admission coming up from ER?" The charge nurse called out. "They're short-staffed down there too, and we need to clear some beds." She wanted to say no, every fiber of her being screamed for a moment's rest. But instead, she heard herself reply, "Sure, no problem." That's what good nurses did, right? They pushed through, no matter what. Even when their backs ached, their heads pounded, and their spirits felt crushed under the weight of responsibility. As she gathered the admission paperwork, Rita's hand brushed against the small photo tucked into her clipboard, her grandmother smiling proudly at her nursing school graduation. "You'll be an angel to your patients," she had said. Rita felt a pang of guilt, knowing how far she felt from that ideal right now. The elevator dinged, signaling the arrival of her new patient. Rita straightened her back, adjusted her name tag, and tried to summon whatever energy she had left. She had no idea that the next patient would change the course of her career forever, though not in the way anyone might have expected. Little did she know, her next actions would spiral into a series of events that would make her question everything about herself, her choices, her attitude, and the very core of what it meant to be a healthcare provider. But for now, she was just an exhausted nurse, trying to make it through another seemingly endless night shift, unaware that she was about to meet someone who would turn her world upside down. The elevator doors opened with a tired groan, revealing 2 orderlies wheeling in an elderly woman on a hospital bed. Rita grabbed her admission forms and approached them, her shoes squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. The woman on the bed looked small and fragile, her silver hair tangled and her hospital gown slightly askew. "Hello, I'm Nurse Rita," she said, trying to inject some warmth into her voice despite her exhaustion. The elderly woman blinked up at her with confused eyes, her hands fidgeting with the thin hospital blanket. "What?" "I'm sorry, dear, you'll have to speak up," the woman replied, her voice quavering. "I don't hear so well these days." Rita noticed she wasn't wearing any hearing aids, though the ER notes mentioned she should have them. I said I am in USA right, she repeated louder, already feeling her patience wearing thin. The woman's name was Mrs. Thompson according to her charts, though she had to keep asking for confirmation of basic information because the patient seemed disoriented. Oh yes, but where am I? My son usually helps me with these things, Mrs. Thompson said for what felt like the 10th time in 5 minutes. Her clothes, neatly folded in the patient belongings bag, were well worn and slightly outdated, suggesting someone of modest means. Rita checked the admission notes again. No family members were present during admission, and the emergency contact number went straight to voicemail. Great, she thought, another complex admission with no family support to help with the paperwork or patient history. You're at Metropolitan General Hospital, Mrs. Thompson. Can you tell me what day it is? Rita asked, starting the required orientation questions. The woman's forehead wrinkled in concentration. Is it Tuesday? No, Wednesday. I'm sorry, dear. Everything's a bit fuzzy since my fall. She patted her pockets frantically. Oh, my pills. I need my pills from home. They're in a blue container, or was it green? Rita felt a headache building behind her eyes. The medication reconciliation alone would take forever if the patient couldn't even remember what she was taking. She glanced at her watch. She still had 5 other patients waiting for their morning medications. As they wheeled Mrs. Thompson to her room, the woman kept asking questions, each one adding to Rita's mounting frustration. Will someone call my son? He works at an important office downtown. He's very busy, you know. Such an important man. We'll try to contact your family once you're settled, Rita assured her. Though internally she was wondering if this very important son couldn't be bothered to answer his phone when his mother was in the hospital. The next hour was a blur of attempted assessments and repeated explanations. Mrs. Thompson couldn't remember her medical history, insisted on a detailed explanation of every single question Rita asked, and needed 3 trips to the bathroom in 60 minutes. Her walking was unsteady, requiring close supervision each time. Nurse Rita. Mrs. Thompson called out just as Rita was finally finishing up the admission paperwork. I think I forgot to tell you about my heart medicine, or did I already mention it? Everything's so confusing in this place. Rita's pen pressed so hard against the paper it nearly tore through. The woman's constant questions and confusion were pushing her already frayed nerves to the breaking point. She looked at Mrs. Thompson's one sweater hanging in the closet, her scuffed old shoes, and the plastic watch on her wrist. Just another confused elderly patient with no one to look after her properly, she thought dismissively. I'm sorry, but did you say when my son would come? He's very good at explaining things to the doctors. He knows all the right words, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice taking on a proud tone despite her confusion. Other patients were starting to take notice of the constant calls coming from the room. Mr. Lee across the hall raised his eyebrows sympathetically as Rita rushed past his door for what seemed like the 100th time. The morning shift would arrive in a few hours, and Rita still had so much to do. She hadn't even started on her required documentation, and now this one patient was taking up all her time with endless questions and needs. As she left the room, she heard Mrs. Thompson call out again, Nurse? Just one more thing. Rita's hands clenched at her sides. She had no idea that her next actions would lead to consequences she never could have imagined, or that this seemingly ordinary night shift was about to become the turning point of her entire career. The sun was just beginning to peek through the windows of the geriatric ward, casting long shadows in the hallway. Rita took a deep breath, trying to center herself before returning to Mrs. Thompson's room. She couldn't have known that in just a few hours, her whole world would be turned upside down, all because of how she chose to handle the next few moments with this one elderly patient. The morning medication rounds should have been routine. Rita pushed her med cart down the hallway, her shoulders tense from hours of stress. The cart's squeaky wheel echoed through the corridor, a sound that normally wouldn't bother her, but today it felt like nails on a chalkboard. She paused outside room 215, taking a deep breath before entering Mrs. Thompson's room. The elderly woman was sitting up in bed, her silver hair even more disheveled than before, adding to her confused appearance. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Time for your morning medications, Rita announced, her voice straining to maintain professionalism. She began sorting through the various pills prescribed by the ER doctor. "Oh dear, what are all those for?" Mrs. Thompson squinted at the small paper cup of pills. "The round white one, is that my blood pressure medicine? Or maybe it's for my joints? My regular pills at home look different." Rita's hand tightened around the medication cup. "These are your prescribed medications, Mrs. Thompson. The doctor reviewed your history and ordered what you need." She tried explaining each pill, but Mrs. Thompson interrupted every few seconds with another question. "But my son always checks my medicine first," Mrs. Thompson insisted, her hands trembling as she reached for her glasses. "Could we wait until he comes? He knows all about my medications." The sound of Rita's teeth grinding was almost audible. "Mrs. Thompson, these medications need to be taken now. Your son isn't here, and we can't wait." Her words came out sharper than intended, but her patience was hanging by a thread. Just then, Mrs. Thompson's water pitcher tipped over, spilling across the bedside table and onto Rita's scrubs. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Let me help." Mrs. Thompson's sudden movement knocked the cup of pills from Rita's hand, sending them scattering across the floor. Something inside Rita snapped. The exhaustion, the stress, the endless questions, it all came pouring out at once. "Are you kidding me?" she burst out, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how busy we are? Do you think you're the only patient here?" Mrs. Thompson shrank back against her pillows, but Rita wasn't finished. Her voice took on a mocking tone as she continued, "Oh, my son this, my son that. Well, where is this wonderful son of yours? Too busy with his important job to answer the phone when his mother's in the hospital." I'm sorry," Mrs. Thompson whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't mean to be trouble." But Rita was past the point of stopping. She mimicked Mrs. Thompson's trembling voice, loud enough for nearby rooms to hear. "Oh, nurse, what's this pill for? Oh, nurse, I need to use the bathroom again. Oh, nurse, can we wait for my son?" From across the hall, Mr. Lee watched with wide eyes. A few doors down, Mrs. Patel covered her mouth in shock. Even the cleaning staff member mopping the floor nearby froze in place. "You know what? Since you can't take your medications like a normal person, you'll just have to wait. I have other patients who actually cooperate with their care." Rita stormed out of the room, leaving Mrs. Thompson sitting there, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. 20 minutes later, the call light from room 215 blinked on. Mrs. Thompson's quiet voice came through the intercom. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I really need to use the bathroom." Rita deliberately took her time responding, finishing her coffee and paperwork before finally heading to the room. When she arrived, it was too late. Mrs. Thompson had tried to make it to the bathroom herself and had an accident. "Look what you made happen," Rita muttered, throwing supplies onto the bedside table. "This could have been avoided if you'd just been patient." As she helped clean up Mrs. Thompson, she didn't notice the nursing assistant in the doorway, watching with a horrified expression. She didn't see the phone in the assistant's hand, or realize that someone was already making their way up to administration. The morning sun was now streaming through the windows, marking the end of Rita's shift. She felt a twisted sense of satisfaction as she gave her report to the day shift nurse, describing Mrs. Thompson as difficult and attention-seeking. As Rita gathered her belongings from her locker, her phone buzzed with a message from her supervisor, "Please come to my office before you leave." She assumed it was about the upcoming schedule changes. After all, what else could it be? She had no idea that in the next few minutes, her entire professional world was about to come crashing down around her. Rita dragged her tired feet toward the hospital administrator's office, her mind already dreaming of her bed at home. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and the early morning sunlight streaming through the windows did nothing to lift her mood. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, expecting a quick meeting about scheduling. "Come in," a stern voice called out. Rita's stomach dropped as she opened the door and found not just the hospital administrator, Mr. Chen, but also the director of nursing and the head of human resources sitting around the conference table. Their faces were grim. "Please, take a seat," Mr. Chen gestured to an empty chair. Rita's legs felt wobbly as she sat down. Something was very wrong. "Nurse Patel, we've received some disturbing reports about your behavior toward a patient this morning," Mr. Chen began, his fingers drumming against a stack of papers. Multiple staff members witnessed you mocking and verbally abusing Mrs. Thompson in room 215. Rita's throat went dry. I was just frustrated. She kept asking the same questions over and over and, "Do you know who Mrs. Thompson is?" The director of nursing cut in, her voice sharp. Rita shrugged slightly. "Just another confused elderly patient, woe." "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Chen interrupted, "is Catherine Thompson, the former director of nursing at Metropolitan General for over 30 years. She established our entire geriatric care program, which is now ranked among the top 10 in the country." The blood drained from Reva's face. Her hands began to shake as Mr. Chen continued. "And her son, who you so dismissively mocked. That would be Mayor Robert Thompson. He was out of state at an emergency conference when his mother fell. He's been trying to reach the hospital all night, but there were issues with our phone system." Rita felt the room spinning. The worn clothes, the confused behavior, none of it had fit with who Mrs. Thompson really was. Images of her cruel behavior flashed through her mind. The mocking voice, the deliberate delays, the harsh words. "Mayor Thompson is on his way here now," the HR director added quietly. "He finally got through to us 20 minutes ago and is absolutely livid about how his mother was treated. The nursing assistant recorded part of your interaction on her phone because she was so shocked by your behavior." Tears welled up in Rita's eyes as the reality of her actions began to sink in. "I didn't know. I was just so tired. I've been working so many shifts." "That's no excuse for treating any patient that way," the director of nursing said firmly. "Whether they're the mayor's mother or not, every patient deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Just then, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Through the office window, Rita could see a group of people rushing past, led by a tall man in a suit who looked ready to tear the building apart. Mayor Thompson had arrived. "He's demanding to see everyone involved in his mother's care," Mr. Chen explained, standing up. "But first, he's going to his mother's room. The staff tells me she's been crying all morning, afraid to ask for help because of how you treated her." Rita's profession flashed before her eyes. All her years of study, the long hours of training, her grandmother's proud face at her graduation. How had she let herself fall so far from the caring nurse she'd once been? "Several staff members have already submitted written statements," the HR director explained, spreading out papers on the table. "Mr. Lee across the hall, Mrs. Patel in 217, 2 nursing assistants, and even the night janitor, they all witnessed your behavior and were appalled." The hospital's legal team arrived next, carrying more paperwork. Words like disciplinary action and formal investigation floated around the room. Rita sat there, numb with shock and shame, as they discussed the potential consequences of her actions. Through the office walls, she could hear Mayor Thompson's voice booming down the hallway. "My mother spent her entire career making this hospital a better place for elderly patients. And this is how you repay her legacy." The morning sun now filled the office completely, highlighting the tears rolling down Reva's cheeks. A news van pulled up outside the hospital. Apparently, word had already leaked to the local media about how the mayor's mother had been treated by hospital staff. "We need to discuss your immediate future at this hospital," Mr. Chen said gravely. "But first, I think you need to understand exactly what happened here. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just any patient. She was someone who dedicated her life to teaching nurses like you how to care for elderly patients with compassion and dignity. The protocols you ignored this morning, she wrote many of them herself." Rita's world had completely shattered. As she sat there, listening to the growing chaos around her, she realized that her worst night shift had turned into something far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. And somewhere in the hospital, a kind elderly woman who had given decades of her life to nursing was afraid to ask for help because of Reba's cruelty. The following days felt like a nightmare Rita couldn't wake up from. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the local newspaper's headline, "Mayor's mother mistreated at Metropolitan General. Hospital launches investigation." Though they hadn't named her, everyone at work knew she was that nurse. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from coworkers. Some expressed disappointment, others shared their own stories of burnout, but most simply withdrew from her completely. The nursing group chat she'd been part of for 2 years suddenly went quiet whenever she appeared online. The hospital's investigation moved quickly. Rita found herself sitting through meeting after meeting, watching video clips of her behavior recorded by the nursing assistant. Each time she saw herself mocking Mrs. Thompson's trembling voice, she felt physically ill. "I didn't realize how bad it looked," she whispered during one of the disciplinary meetings. The committee members exchanged glances as they played another clip, this one showing her deliberately ignoring Mrs. Thompson's calls for help. The hospital required her to attend mandatory sensitivity training. Sitting in a room with other healthcare workers who'd been reported for various infractions, Rita couldn't help but notice she was the only one there for outright cruelty. Most others had made technical mistakes or accidentally breached privacy policies. During her first sensitivity training session, the instructor asked everyone to share why they were there. Rita's voice shook as she explained her story. "I was tired, overworked, stressed about money." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "And would you accept those excuses if someone treated your grandmother that way?" the instructor asked quietly. Rita couldn't answer through her tears. Back at work, she was transferred to the orthopedic ward, far away from the geriatric unit. But news traveled fast in hospitals. When she walked into the break room, conversations stopped. Nobody wanted to risk being associated with the nurse who'd humiliated the mayor's mother. Her new patients seemed to know something was off too. They'd watch her cautiously, as if trying to decide if she was trustworthy. One elderly man actually requested a different nurse after hearing whispers from a visitor about that nurse from the news. The worst part was the letter that arrived at her apartment. It contained dozens of statements from patients and families who'd witnessed her behavior that night. Mr. Lee wrote about how he'd wanted to speak up but felt too afraid. Mrs. Patel described how she'd cried listening to Rita mock an elderly woman who reminded her of her own mother. Rita's grandmother called from India after somehow hearing about the incident. "Beta, what happened to you?" she asked, her voice heavy with disappointment. "This is not the nurse I watched graduate. This is not my granddaughter who wanted to help people." The hospital's HR department mandated weekly counseling sessions. During her first session, the counselor asked her to read Mrs. Thompson's patient statement out loud. Rita's hands trembled as she read. "I felt worthless, like I was just a burden. Every time I needed help, I saw annoyance in her eyes. I spent my whole life trying to teach nurses to be kind to elderly patients, and here I was, afraid to ask for basic care." Mayor Thompson had gone to the media, not to attack Rita personally, but to highlight the larger issues of burnout and understaffing in healthcare. Still, every time his face appeared on the local news, Rita felt a fresh wave of shame. Her bank account took a hit too. The week-long suspension without pay meant she barely made rent. The mandatory counseling sessions and sensitivity training weren't cheap either. She started picking up extra shifts at a pharmacy just to make ends meet. One morning, she overheard two nurses talking in the locker room. "Did you hear? Mrs. Thompson is doing much better now. Such a sweet lady, can you believe someone treated her that way?" They went quiet when they noticed Rita standing there. The hospital newsletter published an article about Mrs. Thompson's contributions to the geriatric care program. Reading about all she'd accomplished, the research studies she'd led, the training programs she'd developed, the countless nurses she'd mentored, made Rita's actions feel even more shameful. At night, Rita would lie awake, replaying every moment of that horrible shift. She thought about how easily stress and exhaustion have stripped away her professionalism, exposing a cruel side she hadn't known existed. The realization that she was capable of such behavior terrified her. But rock bottom has a way of forcing people to make choices. As Rita sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, avoided by her former friends and colleagues, she knew she had to decide. Would she let this incident define her career, or would she find a way to learn from it and become a better nurse? Rita sat at her desk late one night, staring at a blank piece of paper. She'd started and crumpled up dozens of attempts to write an apology letter to Mrs. Thompson. Nothing seemed good enough, sincere enough, or worthy of forgiveness. "Dear Mrs. Thompson," she finally wrote, her hand shaking slightly. "I spent weeks trying to find the right words to apologize for my behavior. The truth is, there are no right words. What I did was inexcusable." As she continued writing, tears dropped onto the paper, smudging some of the ink. She didn't try to hide them. They were part of her truth now. I was exhausted, stressed, and overwhelmed, but these aren't excuses. They're wake-up calls. You dedicated your life to teaching nurses like me how to care for patients with dignity and respect. That night, I failed not just you, but everything you spent your career building." The words began flowing more easily now, straight from her heart. "Your son mentioned in his TV interview that you used to tell young nurses, every patient is someone's whole world. I've been thinking about that a lot. You were someone's whole world too, and I treated you like you were nothing but an inconvenience." After finishing the letter, Rita didn't mail it right away. She carried it with her for 3 days, reading it over and over, making sure every word was honest and true. Finally, she dropped it off at the hospital administration office, along with a separate letter to Mayor Thompson. To her surprise, a response came just 2 days later. The mayor's office requested a meeting, not to yell at her or demand her firing, but because Mrs. Thompson wanted to talk. Rita's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she walked into the hospital's conference room. Mrs. Thompson sat there, looking much better than the last time Rita had seen her. The confused, frightened look was gone, replaced by the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades running a hospital ward. "Sit down, dear," Mrs. Thompson said quietly. Rita noticed she was wearing her hearing aids now, and her clothes were elegant and well-fitted, nothing like the worn outfit from that terrible night. "I got your letter," Mrs. Thompson began. "It reminded me of another nurse many years ago who made a terrible mistake with a patient. She was ready to quit nursing altogether." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That nurse was me." Rita looked up in surprise. Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. "We all have moments that either break us or remake us. The question is, what are you going to do with this moment?" That conversation changed everything. Instead of resigning in shame, Rita asked to take extra training in geriatric care. She spent her days off volunteering at senior centers, learning to see beyond the confusion and demands to the human beings underneath. Word spread through the hospital about Rita's efforts to change. Some staff members remained skeptical, but others began to share their own stories of nearly burning out, of moments when they'd come close to crossing lines themselves. Rita started a support group for healthcare workers, meeting in the hospital cafeteria after shifts. At first, only 2 people showed up. Then 5. Then 12. They talked about stress, about patient care, about the challenge of staying compassionate when running on empty. The hospital administration took notice. They'd asked Rita to work with them on developing better support systems for overworked staff. Her painful experience began transforming into something positive, a way to prevent other nurses from reaching their breaking point. One day, while presenting her ideas to the hospital board, Rita noticed Mrs. Thompson sitting in the back of the room. The older woman gave her an encouraging nod, and Rita felt strength flowing through her veins. She spoke passionately about the need for mental health support, better staffing ratios, and mandatory rest periods. "We can't take care of others if we're broken ourselves," she told the board. "I learned that the hard way. But we can create changes that protect both our patients and our caregivers." The local nursing school invited her to share her story with students. Standing before a room of future nurses, Rita didn't sugarcoat her mistakes. She told them everything: the exhaustion, the cruelty, the consequences, and the path to redemption. "Remember," she would tell them, "every patient has a story. Every confused question comes from a place of fear. Every repeated request comes from a need to be heard. And every single person deserves our patience and respect, no matter how tired we are." Mrs. Thompson began mentoring Rita, sharing wisdom from her decades of nursing experience. Their weekly meetings became a highlight of Rita's schedule, filled with stories, advice, and gradually friendship. "You know," Mrs. Thompson told her one day, "sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth. You're proof of that, dear." As Rita walked through the hospital halls now, she made a point of stopping to really listen to her patients. She saw their humanity first, their fears, their needs, their dignity. The nurse she had been that terrible night felt like a stranger now, a shadow person she'd left behind on her journey toward becoming someone better. 6 months had passed since that life-changing night shift. The hospital's annual Nursing Excellence ceremony was underway, and Rita sat nervously in the audience, smoothing her dress for the 100th time. The auditorium buzzed with conversation as staff members filed in, filling nearly every seat. She spotted Mrs. Thompson in the front row, sitting next to Mayor Thompson. They were both beaming with pride, though Rita still couldn't quite believe they were here to support her. Her own grandmother had flown in from India for the occasion, wearing her finest sari and wiping happy tears from her eyes. The hospital's chief of medicine stepped up to the podium. This year's Most Improved Nurse Award goes to someone whose story reminds us that our lowest moments don't define us. Our response to them does. Rita's heart pounded as she watched the slideshow they'd prepared. There she was, leading a stress management workshop for new nurses. Another photo showed her sitting with an elderly patient, patiently explaining medication instructions. Then a shot of her support group, now so large they had to meet in the hospital's main conference room. 6 months ago, this nurse made a serious mistake, the chief continued. But instead of letting it defeat her, she used it as a catalyst for change. She's helped implement new staff support programs that have reduced burnout rates by 40% in just half a year. In the audience, Rita saw some of her former critics nodding in approval. The same nursing assistant who had recorded her cruel behavior was now one of her biggest supporters, regularly attending the support group sessions. More importantly, the chief added, she's shown us that true strength isn't in never falling, but in how we pick ourselves up. Her work has inspired changes in hospital policies that will protect both our staff and patients for years to come. Mrs. Thompson stood up slowly, using her cane for support. Rita Patel, she called out in a clear, strong voice, "Would you please come up here?" Walking to the stage felt like floating in a dream. Rita passed rows of familiar faces, patients she'd cared for, colleagues who'd supported her journey, even Mr. Lee, who now always saved her a seat in the cafeteria. As she reached for the award, Mrs. Thompson pulled her into a warm hug instead. "You've made me proud, dear," she whispered. "So very proud." Mayor Thompson stepped up next, announcing a new hospital initiative inspired by Rita's story. "We're establishing the Thompson Patel Nursing Support Fund," he revealed. "It will provide resources for stress management, additional staffing during high-pressure periods, and mental health support for our healthcare workers." Rita's hands trembled as she approached the microphone. The speech she prepared suddenly felt inadequate. Looking out at the sea of faces, she decided to speak from her heart instead. 6 months ago, I was a different person, she began. I let stress and exhaustion strip away my humanity, and worse, I stripped away someone else's dignity. But someone very wise showed me that our mistakes don't have to be our ending. They can be our beginning. She turned to Mrs. Thompson, who was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "You could have demanded I be fired. Instead, you showed me grace I didn't deserve and wisdom I desperately needed. You taught me that true nursing isn't just about medical care. It's about seeing the person behind the patient." The support group members were all there, filling 2 full rows. Rita smiled at them. "To every healthcare worker who's ever felt overwhelmed, who's ever been pushed to their limit, you're not alone. We're building a community where it's okay to admit we're struggling, where asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness." She held up her award, letting the lights catch its surface. "This isn't just my story. It's a reminder that we all have the capacity to change, to grow, to become better than our worst moments. Every patient who trusts us with their care deserves our very best selves." As applause filled the auditorium, Rita caught sight of her grandmother beaming in the audience. The proud smile on her face was identical to the one in the photo Rita still kept in her clipboard, but now Rita finally felt worthy of it. Later that evening, during the reception, a new nurse approached her. "I was so stressed during my shift today," she admitted quietly. "I remembered your story and took a moment to breathe instead of snapping at a patient. Thank you for being so open about your journey." Rita watched as Mrs. Thompson charmed a group of young nurses with stories from her own early days in healthcare. The older woman's eyes sparkled as she shared wisdom gained from decades of experience, now passing the torch to a new generation. Mayor Thompson joined them, carrying cups of punch. "You know," he said to Rita, "when I first heard about what happened to my mother, I was furious. Now I'm grateful. Your story is helping create changes that will protect countless patients and nurses." As the evening wound down, Rita found a quiet moment to stand by the window, looking out at the hospital where her worst mistake had transformed into her greatest lesson. A year ago, she'd been a burnt-out nurse who'd lost her way. Now she was helping others find theirs. Mrs. Thompson appeared beside her, gently patting her hand. "Sometimes," she said softly, "our biggest falls lead us to our highest purpose. You've proven that, my dear. You've proven that beautifully."